Okay, so I'm getting started now. So this is my cue card. This side has the notes and then this side is blank. Okay, if everybody can wave at the camera, wave. There's one here, okay. And okay, so I guess we'll just get started. Ready? When I was a kid, I liked to play with dirt. I used to make mud pies, dig holes, anything I could do to make a mess. As an adult, I still play with dirt in the form of clay. I've been doing pottery for the past 8 years, and my favorite thing to build is vases. This particular vase won first place in a juried art competition in my county. Today, I'll be explaining how to build a vase using the coil method. All it takes are 6 easy steps: wedging, rolling, extruding, layering, closing the gaps, and smoothing the surface. By the end of my speech, I hope you'll understand all that goes into this messy medium. If you'll go to the next slide, you'll see the first step is wedging. The first and most important step in the process is wedging the clay. According to the Ceramic Arts Network, this helps to remove any air bubbles and makes the clay a consistent texture. It's important not to have any air pockets in your clay because when it goes into the kiln, it's fired at nearly 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and the heat makes the air expand, but with nowhere to escape, it causes the piece to crack. So in order to wedge the clay, I'm using a wedging table, as you can see in the example. The wedging table is just a flat surface with a piece of wire that's used to cut the clay. So to wedge the clay, you'll need to cut it in half, then put your two halves together, and using a pushing motion, you'll want to meld the clay back together. You'll continue this process over and over until you cut it and you see there's no bubbles. As you can see in the 6th example on this slide, that's what it should look like, not like the 5th one. Moving on to the next slide, you'll see I'm using a slab roller to roll out the base for our vase. So what you'll need to do is put it inside the slab roller and roll out a piece as wide as you want your base to be, and it should be about 1/4 inch thick. On the next slide, you'll see I'm using an extruder to make my coils. Hand-rolled coils would work too, but the extruder helps to make the coils a consistent thickness and length. Put your wedge clay inside the barrel of the extruder and push the plunger down. You'll want to use a swift and smooth motion to do this in order to make it not lopsided. You'll probably need about 10 coils, and they should be about 1.5 feet long each. Next, now that we have our coils and our base, we'll have to put them together using a method called score and slip. For this method, you'll need a scratching tool and slip, which is a soupy mixture of clay and water. So first, score the base of your vase and measure out how wide you need your first coil to be. You can see the example of this in my slide. Cut the coil to be that length and then attach it with a thick layer of slip. Make sure that you are scoring and slipping every layer of coils. If you don't, a lot of times they'll come apart. This is an example of one of my vases that broke because it wasn't scored and slipped properly. It was originally about 2 coils longer, but it just broke off at this point because it wasn't attached properly. So continue building up your base, vase. If you want the shape of it to move outward, you'll have to put the coils on the outside of the rim. And if you want it to move inward, you'll like to put it towards the inside of the rim. Once you have a structure built that you like, we'll have to close the gaps between the coils. On the next slide, you'll see I'm using a modeling tool, but your fingers would work too. So take the tool and drag the clay from the upper coil to the one below it, filling in any of the spaces between the coils. You'll have to do this on every layer of the coils. According to Fly School, it's very important to make sure that you're attaching clay that's the same wetness. A lot of times you can attach wetter and drier clay, but when it starts to dry out, they'll dry out at different speeds and they'll just crack apart. Once all of your gaps are closed, we can smooth out the surface of the vase. On the next slide, you'll see I'm using a metal rib and a small damp sponge. Take the rib and drag it across the surface of your vase, and little pieces of clay will come off. This is good because it helps to thin out the walls of your vase and make sure that when you fire it, it's not too heavy and thick. If you start to drag the rib across and it starts to bend your piece a little bit, it's probably too wet to be doing it at this point. So you'll need to dry it out until it's leather hard, meaning when you touch it, it doesn't move. Once you don't see any more dents in the surface, you can move on to using the sponge. The sponge is used to just smooth out the outermost layer. And make sure you take your time with this step because any scratches or dents in the surface will be exaggerated more when you fire it. So that's all that goes into building a coil vase: wedging, rolling, extruding, layering, closing the gaps, and smoothing the surface. If you, like me, like getting your hands messy and are looking for a new hobby, I would strongly suggest trying pottery. It can be very difficult and frustrating work because your things will fall apart, they'll explode in the kiln, they'll be built wrong, but by the end, when you have a piece of art that you built from a lump of clay, it's indescribably rewarding. Are there any questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Tasha, what's your question?
I was wondering, can you use this coiling method to make larger pieces, or is there like a maximum thickness you can make the coils?
You can actually, the extruder has different, they're called dies that you can put on the end of them that can make different thickness of coils. So if you do want to make thicker coils, you can. And actually this one is, it's probably about 2 feet tall. This one was made with the coil method. You can see on the inside the coils. Well, you probably can't, but yes, you can make them taller. The only problem is when you start to build them upward, if the coils are too wet, because to make them wrap around in the way that you need to, they'll need to be a little bit wet. But then if they're too wet, then the pressure will start to weigh on them. So I've never made one big enough for it to not work, but I guess there's a limit, yes.
What is your favorite part of the process?
I really like the smoothing out process because it's very satisfying to see the clay come off, you know, and start to see it like really take shape.
Yeah. If you make larger coils, is there more of a risk of like air bubbles getting trapped in each of the coils?
If you wedge your clay properly, the air bubbles will pretty much be out. But it is important not to make too big of, you can't make any surface that's too wide go into the kiln because it won't fire properly. So like a lot of times because it's so thick, it'll be hard for the inside to dry out and it just won't fire properly. Also, once you fire it, as I said earlier, it becomes very heavy. So anything that's gonna be too big, you need to make hollow. Like for example, this octopus head is hollow inside. So otherwise it would be very heavy. Yeah.
How long does it usually take for the clay to dry?
So it depends on the temperature outside and everything. If you want to speed up the process, a lot of times we'll put things out in the sun, but you also need to be careful not to dry things out too quickly because it'll start to crack if it does that. So for example, this was only a part of the process because you still have to fire the piece once you've built it. So once it's time to fire it, you'll need to dry it out a little bit more because you can't put a wet piece into the kiln. It needs to be mostly, we call it bone dry. So it needs to be like mostly dried out before you put it into the kiln. Otherwise, if it dries out too quickly, it'll break. So you need to do it slowly, but it really depends on how fast you want it to dry out. You can make it faster or slower depending. Also, it depends on how big it is too.
Do you prefer to make smaller or larger pieces?
I prefer larger pieces, but you know, I just think that they're more like interesting to look at, and it's more of a challenge because when they get to be larger, it's sometimes harder to make it balanced and even. But I mean, I've made smaller pieces too. I just feel like I'm always more impressed by my larger pieces than my smaller ones.
Are there pros to using the coiling method versus using like a pottery wheel?
So the pottery wheel, they both have pros and cons, but I prefer the coiling method because it's a lot more, you're a lot more able to adjust the shape of the things you need to make. So the pottery wheel, you can only make things that are like even. But I have another piece, I don't have it with me right now. I have another piece that's kind of lopsided on purpose. Like the front of it is kind of leans this way. And that wouldn't be possible in a pottery wheel because it spins. So it needs to be perfectly even for you to really shape it in that way. But at the same time, the coiling method takes a lot longer because you have to build each individual layer, whereas the wheel, you just do it all at once. So there's definitely pros and cons to both, but I prefer the coil method. It's a little bit more adjustable. Is that all? Okay, great. Well, thank you guys for coming. And I'll end this now.